What are your thoughts of the consequences and some argue unintended consequences? Julie?
I think that's the most important place to go, and the effect this will have on children who are settled in schools and families who have already chosen schools and they're in local areas. The effect is going to be, I think all the reports, they might not agree about the amount, but they all agree that children are going to be displaced. So tens of thousands of children will be priced out of independent education because their parents won't be able to afford that anymore. And that means they need to find local alternatives. Most of those parents are saying they will look to local state schools. And we know that in plenty of areas, there are local authorities saying there aren't places available at the moment. The problem is we don't know what the pattern of movement is going to be. So it's very, very unpredictable. But we're really concerned about the over 100,000 special needs pupils in independent schools who could then need particular support in state schools that simply might not be there.
If you want to come back on that, I mean, there's some interesting points there.
Well, Sam, my first point is that, I mean, why is it that the independent sector can't do what the state sector has had to do for the past 14 years? And you'll have noticed there's a report today that says state school funding hasn't increased since 2010. Why can't they do what state schools, of which I'm a governor of one, have had to do, which is to make cuts, and I'm afraid to say redundancies, which inevitably had an effect on the children. And can I just remind you, there are 8 million children in the state sector and 500,000 in the private school sector. So I think we need to rebalance this debate, to make sure we take in the voices of the 8 million, the 93% who are in state schools. Why can't private schools make cuts and then they wouldn't have to add anything to their fees and then parents could stay if they wanted to?
Julie?
Well, it's not a case of choosing one over the other. That's very unfair. State schools have been suffering lack of funding. I'm a governor at an independent school and at a state academy in North London. And both those schools have actually been looking at their cost centres. But independent schools also have to pay for things that state school funding doesn't have to cover. And they've been subject to the same cost of living crisis that parents are suffering. So for independent schools, they've come through Brexit and COVID. They have to pay to sort of look after their buildings. There's a whole range of those. They have cost inflation on things like goods and services and food and wage inflation. And the independent schools have to pay their own way in teacher pensions, which has now gone up to 28% this year by employer contribution. So there are all sorts of extra costs that are incurred by independent schools. Of course, they must be efficient and run themselves efficiently. You're absolutely right, Fiona. The main way they can save money would be to have to look at their staffing, because over 70% of their budgets are spent on staffing. But again, why should independent schools be punished for the fact that the state system has not been properly funded over time? These are all aspects of the same overall education system. And at the moment,
they're not. Sorry, can I just interrupt? They're not. It's not the same system, because the children in independent schools are funded on average at £18,000 a year, £6,000 a term, which is the same funding per pupil for a year in the area where I was a parent and I'm a governor. So we have to pay all those costs as well. We have to look after our buildings. We have to provide extracurricular activity. We have to pay for staff. There may be some extra costs in the independent sector, but you get a lot more money to pay for them. So I go back to my essential point. It just isn't fair that we should be subsidising what is a luxury education for some children who are already the most privileged in society, while the least well off, and many of those children have been really badly hit.
What do you mean by already the most privileged in society?
Because if anybody families who can afford to pay private school fees will be better off probably than most of the children in the state sector. And I'm talking specifically about the most disadvantaged children for whom a private school education wouldn't even be a dream. So in the state sector, we're trying to narrow the gaps. We're trying to catch up from COVID, trying to deal with attendance problems with no extra funds at all. And I just had a look before I came on this programme. Private school fees went up by 8% last year. So, they've chosen to have a rise that was over and above inflation, whereas state schools have had nothing. So it seems to me that it's not unreasonable.
That's a point, Julie.